Today we're going to look at two of his lines from the song Joe's Blues off the Intercontinental album, and specifically his use of the diminished scales. So Joe's Blues is a 12-bar blues in the key of G, and both these examples happen over the first 4 bars of the form, moving back and forth between the 1 chord and the 4 chord. Now there are 2 diminished scales we're going to look at today. The Dominant Diminished Scale, which we can play over dominant chords, which in this case we're going to play from the 1 chord moving to the 4 chord. And then the Tonic Diminished Scale, which we can play over diminished chords, which we're going to use to play over the 4 chord going back to the 1 chord. This first example uses the Dominant Diminished Scale to move from G7 to C7 in bar 4. Okay, before we jump into this lick, let's take a look at the Dominant Diminished or half-whole diminished scale. Now it's commonly called the half-whole scale because it's a series of half steps and whole steps. So the notes are G, A flat, B flat, B, C sharp, D, E, and F. The intervals are root, flat 2 or flat 9, sharp 2 or sharp 9, third, sharp 4, 5, 6, and flat 7. If we take a closer look at these notes, we'll notice we have all the notes of a G7 chord, the root, third, fifth, and flat 7th. We also have some interesting altered notes like the flat 9, the sharp 9, and the sharp 4. So it's very common to use this scale to add an altered sound to functioning dominant chords, which is exactly what's happening in this example when we move from G7 to C7. G7 is actually functioning as the dominant 5 chord of C. Now we can find the 5 chord of C by going up the C major scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we see that G7 is the 5 chord of C. So even though we're moving from the 1 chord to the 4 chord of our progression, we still have a 5-to-1 cadence. Now I also want to mention that because this is a diminished scale, it works just like diminished chords, which means it's symmetrical and can be moved up and down in minor thirds. So you can take any diminished scale idea, move it up 4 frets or down 4 frets, and you get the same combination of notes, just in a different order. So let's take a look at this lick. The phrase starts out with some notes from the G7 scale, or G mixolydian, which is just a G major scale with a flat 7th in it. We start by going up from the 5th of the scale to the 9th. Then we jump down to flat 7, 6, 5. So the first part is just straight out of a G7 scale. Then here's where we get into the diminished part of the phrase. We come from the root and then roll down chromatically to the 6th. So those chromatic notes are really just there for effect. Really we're targeting the root and the 6th from the diminished scale. Then we come down 5, sharp 4, 3, down to the 6th, then 1, sharp 9, flat 9, 1, flat 7. And then finally we resolve to E, which is the 3rd of our C chord. So we have a really nice little diminished line that uses a bunch of notes from that diminished scale to build tension and then resolve to a chord tone of the C chord. Now, as I mentioned before, this diminished scale is symmetrical, so we can move it up and down in minor thirds and play these same ideas to get different variations. So if we take this lick and move it down a minor third, instead of starting on the root G, we would start on the 6th, E, and then roll down to the sharp 4, then play 3, sharp 9, flat 9, sharp 4, 6, root, flat 7, 6, 5, and then resolve down a whole step to C, the root of the C chord. So I'll play that along to the track and you can see how that sounds. Okay, so what if we move it up a minor third? So instead of starting on G, now we're going to start on the sharp 9. And we'll roll down to the root and then play flat 7, 6, 5, down to the root again. then sharp 9, sharp 4, 3, sharp 9, flat 9, and then resolve to the 5th of our C chord. So I'll play that along to the track and you can hear how that sounds. Okay, so there's one more variation. We can move it up one more minor third, and now instead of starting on the sharp 9, we're starting on the sharp 4. So we can roll down from the sharp 4 to the sharp 9, and then play flat 9, root, flat 7th, down to the sharp 9 again, and then sharp 4, 6, 5, sharp 4, 3, and then resolve to B flat, which is the flat 7th of our C chord. Now I'll play that along to the track and you can see how that variation sounds. So you can see how moving this scale around in minor thirds gives you different inversions of the same scale. And each one of these lines resolves to a different note of the C7 chord. Okay, so let's look at another example from Joe Pass's solo. This example is going to use the tonic diminished scale or the whole half diminished scale to move from the 4 chord back to the 1 chord in bar 2 of our blues form. So this line is chock full of some really great ideas, but we're just going to focus on the first part of it where he outlines the whole half diminished scale over the C7 chord and then resolves back to a chord tone of the G chord. So this line uses the whole half diminished scale, which is a whole step followed by a half step. So the notes are G, A, B flat, C, C sharp or D flat, D sharp or E flat, E, F sharp, and then back to G. Now the reason this works in this spot in the progression is that it's very common when you're going from the 4 chord back to the 1 chord to add a passing diminished chord, a half step up from the 4. So you'll hear this a lot where it'll go from C7 to C sharp diminished 7th and then back to G7. Now because these diminished chords are symmetrical, C sharp diminished 7th is the same as E diminished 7th and G diminished 7th and B flat diminished 7th. So we can treat that passing diminished chord just as a 1 diminished, so G diminished. And just like the chords, the scale is symmetrical in the same way. So if we're treating that as a C sharp diminished chord and we're going to play a tonic diminished scale over it, we can play the G tonic diminished scale right in that spot. So this line starts out over the C7 chord, and he's playing notes out of this whole half diminished scale, but he's kind of outlining the sound of a C7 by going up to the 3rd, the 5th, and then walking up to the flat 7th, which are all notes out of our C7 chord. Then from here he really breaks into a straight scale run, playing up this G tonic diminished scale. And then from here, he's targeting a chord tone from the G chord, which is the chord we're moving to. And he's targeting D, which is the 5th of that chord, and encircling that note by playing a note below, a note above, and then landing on D, the chord tone of that G7 chord, right on the downbeat of the chord change. So again, we can move this line around in minor thirds up and down the fretboard to get some really interesting variations on this idea. Hopefully this lesson sheds some light on these 2 diminished scales and where exactly they fit in a blues progression and how you can move them around on the fretboard to play some different interesting ideas. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.